Deep in the dense jungles of Africa, a criminal network was preparing to dig its roots deeper into the world. A meeting was underway between Stephen Obano, the leader of an armed group, and Mr. White, the broker of a shadowy secret organization. Mr. White introduced Obano to a calm, mathematically brilliant banker named Le Chiffre, a man who claimed no country and no religion. Money was his only faith. His business was laundering the dirty cash of criminals across the globe and multiplying it. Trusting him, Obano handed over 3 cases stuffed with notes, a full $100 million in cash, with a single condition that he be able to pull his money out from any corner of the world the moment he wanted. Le Chiffre studied those cases with his cold eyes and accepted the terms. From there, the story shifts to another part of Africa, Madagascar, where under the harsh sun and dust a mongoose and a snake were locked in a fight, surrounded by a roaring crowd. But while everyone's eyes were glued to the animals, one man's gaze was hunting for a wanted man in that crowd, James Bond, a new agent of British Secret Service MI6, as clever as he was dangerous. His eyes were fixed on a man named Malaka who built explosives for the criminal network. The moment Malaka sensed danger, he bolted, and Bond tore after him. Malaka's body moved like it was made of rubber, leaping across high walls and rooftops like a nimble animal. But Bond was no amateur either, chasing him down like a relentless predator who'd staked his life on the pursuit. Malaka fled into a foreign embassy, certain that the protection of its officials and guards would save him. But Bond didn't care one bit about international law. He stormed past the guards, grabbed Malaka and began dragging him out, only to be cornered at the gate. An official ordered him to drop his weapon and release the man, and Bond quietly obeyed. Then in the very next instant pulled a second gun from his pocket, took down both Malaka and the corrupt official, and set off a blast at a gas tank. The whole building shook, flames clawed at the sky, and through the billowing smoke Bond vanished with Malaka's bag. But his entire rampage had been caught on the embassy's CCTV. The next morning when his boss M opened the papers and saw her own agent's face plastered across them, she was furious. Bond had made a mockery of the Secret Service. She suspended him and blocked his ID. But Bond pressed on with his own investigation, because inside Malaka's bag he'd found a phone, and on it a message Bond had sent with a single coded word, ellipsis. It was a signal to launch some operation, and Bond sensed Malaka was just one piece of a far bigger plan. That lead carried Bond to the Bahamas, to a wealthy government contractor named Alex Dimitrios, a man with deep underworld ties. Bond shadowed him like a ghost. That evening Dimitrios arrived at an exhibition near the airport, packed with hundreds of spectators, and Bond watched from the crowd. He saw Dimitrios stash his bag in a storage room, send a text, then place a coin on a poker table and walk off. Bond waited to see who'd come for that coin, but suddenly Dimitrios pressed a knife into Bond's stomach from behind. The cunning man had clocked him all along. Before he could finish Bond off, Bond twisted his arm and turned the blade back on him, leaving Dimitrios slumped on a bench as if he were merely asleep. Checking the fallen man's phone, Bond found a text sent to an unknown number, ellipsis. Dimitrios had come here to pass the signal along, and when Bond looked back at the poker table, the coin was gone. So was the bag. In a crowd that thick, finding the man who'd taken it seemed impossible, so Bond got clever and dialed that unknown number from Dimitrios's phone. A man in the crowd answered, and Bond spotted him, carrying that same black bag. Inside it were the clothes of an airport security guard, which the man pulled on to slip into a restricted area. Bond still couldn't piece together the plan, until the man triggered a fire alarm, threw the whole airport into chaos, grabbed a gun from a security locker, and slipped past staff toward the runway. Just then Paul, still watching Bond's every move, and told him the attacker was named Carlos, and his target was Skyfleet's brand new airplane. That very day, Skyfleet was unveiling the world's largest, most advanced aircraft, its prototype, set for its maiden flight, with the global media covering the launch. Carlos meant to destroy the plane right on the runway and ruin the company. He hijacked a fuel tanker truck loaded with thousands of liters of flammable fuel and sent it roaring toward the runway, his aim clear, ram it straight into the Skyfleet jet. But Bond would not let that happen. He sprinted, leapt onto the speeding tanker, smashed through the windshield, and dropped straight into the cab. He and Carlos grappled, and Carlos kicked Bond down beneath the truck, leaving him dangling, where he spotted a remote-controlled device fixed underneath. Realizing how devastating the blast would be, Bond hauled himself back up and this time overpowered Carlos and threw him under the truck. The tanker was about to slam into the plane, but Bond hit the brakes at the last possible second. He'd barely caught his breath when the police swarmed him, mistaking him for the attacker and arrested him. But Carlos wasn't finished yet, and a sinister smile crossed his face, because his plan wasn't over. He pulled out the detonator for the device still fixed under the truck and pressed it. Then he heard a beep right next to him and froze. Bond had cleverly pulled the device off the truck and clipped it onto Carlos's own belt. Before he could even react, a blast took him out. The Skyfleet jet was safe and so were all its passengers. Bond had caused chaos once again, but he'd stopped a massive tragedy. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, aboard his lavish yacht out at sea, Le Chiffre watched it all live on the news. The moment the anchor announced the jet was safe and the attack foiled, the color drained from his face. Because this entire plan had been Le Chiffre's. He'd made a colossal gamble. To double his client's money, he'd used short selling on the stock market, betting a fortune that Skyfleet's shares would crash. He'd imagined the plane destroyed, the stock plummeting, and himself making billions in a single stroke. But Bond had saved the plane and flipped the whole bet on its head. Instead of crashing, Skyfleet's shares only grew stronger, and Le Chiffre was ruined. He was gripped by terror, because the money he'd lost included the dangerous Obono's 100 million, and he knew Obono and his men didn't understand the word mercy. They would come for his life. The stress was so crushing that instead of tears, blood began to weep from his eye, a condition of his where pressure on his mind made his eyes bleed. Now only one path remained. Get the money back. Fast, by any means. By now M had reached the Bahamas too, pleased with Bond's work. She filled him in on Le Chiffre's scheme and said intelligence reported the banker had devised a big plan to recover his losses. Le Chiffre, she explained, was a cunning fox with no equal at the card table. To win back his money and save his life, he'd organized an enormous poker game at the Casino Royale in Montenegro, Europe. The buy-in alone was 10 million, and the winner would walk away with roughly 115 million, enough for Le Chiffre to clear his debt and survive. But Mem wanted to stop him from ever getting that dirty money back, so she handed Bond a massive mission: go to Montenegro. Because in all of British Secret Service, Bond was the only agent skilled enough at poker to beat Le Chiffre at the table. The mission was simple: beat him, bankrupt him completely, and force him to cut a deal with MI6 for his life, handing over everything he knew about his criminal network. The government arranged Bond's entry into the game. The match at Casino Royale wasn't merely cards. It was a silent war against a global criminal empire, with not just money on the line but thousands of innocent lives. If Bond lost, British government money would flow straight into criminal hands, used to cause untold harm. Losing was not an option, and so the story moved from the Bahamian sun into the cold valleys of Europe. Aboard the high-speed train to Montenegro, Bond looked not just ready but relaxed. He'd been given a partner for this mission, a woman named Vesper Lind, an agent sent by the British Treasury whose one job was to make sure Bond didn't simply hand the enormous 10 million right back to Le Chiffre across the table. After the long journey, the two arrived at Montenegro station, were greeted by a sleek black limousine, and taken to their hotel, where Bond was to check in under the name Arlington Beach so Le Chiffre wouldn't grow suspicious. But Bond gave the receptionist his real name, James Bond. Vesper flared up, snapping at him for using his true name. If Le Chiffre recognized him, the mission was finished. Bond fixed her with a cool look and explained, Le Chiffre is no street thug. His network is formidable. A criminal big enough to host a game like this would already have pulled the files on every player, so there was no point hiding. If Le Chiffre was letting him sit at his table, it meant either he was desperate to make money fast or he'd laid a trap. Bond assured her he was fully alert. As evening fell, Bond strode into the palatial hall of the Casino Royale with total confidence. The world's richest gamblers were there, and there Bond came face to face with Le Chiffre, who certainly recognized him but welcomed him all the same. In that hall was also a man named Mathis, a well-connected local spy there to help Bond. The host then laid out the rules. 10 players, each with 10 million, all of it held electronically in a Swiss bank so the winner could safely withdraw from anywhere in the world. If a player lost all 10 million, he could buy back into the game just once for another 5 million. Each player entered a code into a machine, the only key by which the winner could withdraw the funds. The game began. Early on, Bond deliberately played small hands. He didn't want to win. He wanted to read Le Chiffre, to study how he reacted. But Le Chiffre's flat, expressionless face gave nothing away. The tension was building when Vesper entered the hall in a stunning evening gown, so striking that every man in the room, from waiters to gamblers, turned from the game to stare. Mid-game, Bond rose, walked over to her and kissed her, whispering with a smile not to mistake it for romance. It was a move. He wanted to needle Le Chiffre, to show he cared nothing for this high-stakes game or its money, that his attention was on his beautiful companion instead. Irritation flashed across Le Chiffre's face. Bond had successfully thrown him off. He let Le Chiffre win the first big hand on purpose, acting as if the loss meant nothing, not even showing his cards. Before the next round, the host called a 1-hour break. During it, an associate slipped up to Le Chiffre, whispered in his ear, and left, and an alarmed Le Chiffre got up and walked off, with Bond and Vesper quietly trailing him. Le Chiffre returned to his hotel room where his girlfriend Valenka was waiting, but it was a trap. Out of the darkness stepped O'Bono and his bodyguard, the very men whose money Le Chiffre had sunk. O'Bono, seething, began choking him with a thick rope. Le Chiffre gasped out that he had the money, that he'd win it back by morning. He just needed time. O'Bono loosened the rope and warned him, "No money by dawn, and you vanish from this world," then left with his bodyguard. At that exact moment, Bond and Vesper were hiding in the corridor, listening. Bond instantly pushed Vesper against the wall and kissed her to hide his face, so O'Bono would think they were just a couple lost in romance. But O'Bono's sharp eye caught the earpiece in Bond's ear, and he knew at once Bond was a spy. He drew a blade and attacked. What O'Bono didn't grasp was that Bond wasn't a cunning fox like Le Chiffre, but a ferocious lion. Alone, Bond overpowered both men and took them down right there. He had Mathis quietly handle the aftermath. Sometime later, his wounds cleaned up, Bond was back at the poker table, the tension at its absolute peak now that the stakes had grown so high. The other 8 players had folded, and the contest had narrowed to Bond and Le Chiffre alone. Le Chiffre sat with that cold, stony composure. No doubt, no fear. Across from him, Bond was laser-focused, his hawk's eyes scanning every tiny twitch on Le Chiffre's face. And in this mental war, Bond believed he'd caught a major weakness, what poker calls a bluff. A bluff is that dangerous gambit where a player's cards are weak but his nerve is iron, wearing a mask of confidence as if he holds the best hand in the world, so the opponent folds out of fear. Bond noticed that whenever Le Chiffre bluffed, his left hand drifted up and a finger stroked the vein at his temple, soothing it so his anxiety wouldn't bleed out through his eye. Bond's eyes lit up, certain now that Le Chiffre's cards were weak and he was hiding his worry. Bond himself held a full house, aces over kings, a very strong hand. But then Le Chiffre slid all his chips, the full 10 million, into the middle. Silence swallowed the hall. Vesper signaled Bond not to play the hand, but Bond trusted his cards and his read completely. Sure, Le Chiffre was only scaring him. He pushed in his own 10 million in chips and turned over his cards, and everyone was convinced Bond had won. But in that very instant, a faint smile crossed Le Chiffre's lips. He revealed his hand, 4 jacks. Bond's full house was worthless against it. Bond sat stunned. Le Chiffre had played his mind, deliberately faking the bluff tell, and Bond had walked right into the trap. In a single stroke, he'd lost everything. The mission had failed. Vesper was livid, but Bond hadn't given up. He asked her for another 5 million to buy back in, swearing he now understood Le Chiffre's every move and could bankrupt him in the next hand. Vesper flatly refused, telling him bitterly that he'd lost out of his own arrogance, and she would not throw more government money down his drain. Furious and ashamed, but unable to let that money reach the wrong hands, Bond was left with one option. He grabbed a knife and started toward Le Chiffre, but an American man stopped him. Felix Leiter, one of the players at the table. Felix had watched Bond play and was convinced he could beat Le Chiffre. He quietly revealed he was a CIA agent and offered a deal. He would stake Bond the money to play again, on one condition, that once Bond won he'd hand Le Chiffre over to the Americans. With no other choice, Bond agreed. With fresh resolve and a pile of money, Bond returned to the table and Le Chiffre was stunned to see him. Bond had cracked his bluffing method now. But the cunning banker had set a deadlier trap. His girlfriend Valenka had secretly slipped poison into Bond's drink, a poison that races the heart until it triggers a heart attack. Bond, his eyes fixed in anger on Vesper, lifted the drink without looking and took a sip. Within moments he knew something was terribly wrong, sweat breaking out, his vision fogging. Realizing he'd been poisoned, he rushed to the bathroom, dumped a heap of salt into a glass of water, and drank it to force the poison out. It left his body, but its effect lingered. His heartbeat was slowing as he stumbled to his car and contacted MI6 headquarters, where M and her team were monitoring his vitals through a sensor on his body. They told him there was a defibrillator in the car and to use it before his heart stopped. Bond was losing consciousness but managed to press the pads to his chest and inject himself. Yet when he hit the button, nothing happened. One of the wires hadn't been connected. Before he could fix it, darkness swallowed him. His heart stopped. Just then Vesper, searching for him, arrived and instantly understood a heart attack. She reconnected the loose wire. The machine sprang to life, and without wasting a second she hit the button. Bond's body jolted, and with one deep, gasping breath, his heartbeat returned. He'd come back from the brink, drenched in sweat, panting, but with a new fire in his eyes. He thanked Vesper for saving him and, on unsteady legs but with unbreakable resolve, walked back to the casino. When he reappeared at the table, silence fell. Le Chiffre couldn't believe his eyes. The game climbed to its peak once more. All the other players busted, and it came down to Bond and Le Chiffre with a mountain of 115 million on the line. Le Chiffre smiled and flipped his cards, an ace and a six, which combined with the two aces and the six on the table to make a higher full house. He looked certain of victory. Every eye turned to Bond, whose face betrayed nothing. With perfect calm, he slowly turned over his cards, a 5 and a 7 of spades. Together with the 4, 6, and 8 of spades on the table, Bond held the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of spades, a straight flush, one of the rarest, biggest hands in all of poker. Le Chiffre's smile died in his throat. His face went white, and the blood wept from his eye. He hadn't just lost, he was about to lose his life. He stormed off in a rage. Bankrupting him at last, Bond breathed a sigh of relief. The 115 million was secure. As promised, he handed Felix Leiter the responsibility of capturing Le Chiffre, then went off to a romantic dinner with Vesper, who by now was thoroughly impressed with him. In those tender moments, a message landed on Vesper's phone from Mathis, and she told Bond that Mathis had called her away for some important matter. Bond let her go, but the moment she left, an odd unease crept over him. Why would Mathis need to meet Vesper alone? He chased after her, and stepping outside the hotel, he saw men kidnap Vesper and bundle her into a car. Bond didn't waste a moment, leaping into his own car and flooring it with a roar of the engine. He tore down the dark road after them, but soon the kidnapper's car slipped from view. He pushed faster, and then suddenly saw Vesper bound and lying in the middle of the road. His car was about to hit her when he wrenched the wheel with all his strength. The car flipped wildly through the air and crashed onto its side. Bond survived but was badly hurt. Then Le Chiffre arrived with his men and dragged both Bond and Vesper away. When Bond came to, he was in an old railway tunnel, in Le Chiffre's grip, his body aching all over. Le Chiffre had tied him to a chair and demanded the Swiss bank password. He needed the 115 million back to save his own life. First he revealed that Mathis, the man Bond had taken for an ally, actually worked for him. But Bond refused to even open his mouth, so Le Chiffre turned to brutal methods, interrogating him harshly, blow after blow, each one shaking Bond to his core and threatening worse if he didn't talk. Yet Bond didn't break. After a point he seemed to lose himself, laughing through the pain and mocking Le Chiffre, telling him it wasn't quite working, he'd have to try harder. Le Chiffre snapped, his patience shattered, and was about to take things to a deadly extreme. But just then, a single shot rang out and struck him square in the forehead. He dropped on the spot. His killer was Mr. White, the mysterious broker whose organization funded the whole criminal empire. Because Le Chiffre had now sunk their money and drawn police attention, Mr. White simply removed him. Days later, Bond woke in a hospital under MI6's protection. His first question was whether Vesper was all right, and she was, which flooded him with relief. He had the traitor Mathis arrested. But one thing nagged at him. Why had Mr. White let him and Vesper live? Whatever the reason, Bond was now sick of this dangerous life. Over the mission, he and Vesper had fallen in love, and he began dreaming of leaving it all behind to spend his life with her. Around then, the Swiss banker came to him. The government's 115 million had to be returned, and Bond had Vesper do the honors, telling her the account number and password. She entered them, and the two were freed of a great burden, then set off for the world's most romantic city, Venice, where they spent the most beautiful days of their lives. One such morning, a message reached Vesper. She told Bond she had to go to the bank to withdraw some money, got ready, and left. By coincidence, at that very moment, Mem called Bond, worry in her voice. The Treasury said the 115 million had never been deposited into their account. What was he waiting for? The ground slid out from under Bond. He deposited the money a month ago. He immediately called the Swiss banker to ask which account Vesper had transferred the funds to. The banker wouldn't share that, but said the money was being withdrawn from a Venice bank at that very moment. Bond was stunned. He became certain Vesper had betrayed him, and yet she'd left her phone with him. On it, a message from a man named Gettler. Meet me at the bank in half an hour. Bond rushed to the bank, but she was already gone, then spotted her in the crowd, carrying a briefcase holding all the money in electronic form. Burning with anger and hurt, he followed her through Venice's alleys to a deserted spot, where she met Gettler and handed him the briefcase. They saw Bond and fled into a floating house, a building held up on the water by enormous airbags. Gettler's men opened fire, but Bond aimed straight at the airbags, bursting them, and the whole building began sinking slowly into the Venice Canal. As it sank, Bond fought through Gettler's men one by one, and finally took down Gettler himself. By then the building was more than half underwater. Vesper was trapped inside a lift. Seeing the tears in her eyes, Bond understood she wasn't evil. There had to be some helplessness behind all this. Why else would she have left her phone with him as evidence? He fought to pry the lift open to save her, but Vesper had deliberately locked herself inside. The elevator sank beneath the water and her breath stopped. Bond somehow hauled her out and tried to revive her with CPR, but it was no use. Vesper was gone. Bond cradled her and grieved, and in that moment, Mr. White slipped away with the briefcase of money. Sometime later, Bond had become that cold, stone-hearted spy again, perhaps even harder than before. M told him the bitter truth. The investigation revealed Vesper had a boyfriend named Yusef, whom Mr. White's organization had kidnapped. After Le Chiffre lost the game, they'd threatened Vesper, if she wanted to save her boyfriend, she had to get the money from Bond. She'd agreed, but her feelings for Bond were not a lie. She'd struck a deal with Mr. White. She'd give them the money in exchange for sparing Bond's life. That was why Mr. White had let Bond live that day, warned him to trust no one from now on. But Bond still trusted Vesper, certain she'd left her phone with him for a reason. He checked it, and in the message drafts he found one she'd left just for him. He opened it, a phone number and a name, Mr. White. Bond had been a stranger to Mr. White until now, but Vesper's message lit the path straight to him. At that moment, Mr. White was lounging at a gorgeous, lavish villa in Italy, enjoying himself with the 115 million, when his phone rang. As he asked who was speaking, a shot rang out and struck him in the leg. Mr. White crashed to the ground and crawled toward the stairs, but someone blocked his path, and a voice came, "The name's Bond, James Bond." And right there, Bond brought him down, and with that, the film comes to a close.